Hello and welcome to Topic 5, Criminal Law, Part 1. We spend 2 topics or 2 weeks on the topic of criminal law. And so Part 1 is this week, Topic 5, and you'll be reading the first half of Chapter 4. And in that, we're going to be, this week we're going to be learning about the different categories of law, criminal and civil law, and also the way that we classify crimes, felony and misdemeanor. And that's what's going to be in this lecture. In the second lecture for this week, we're going to be taking a look at the elements of the crime, actus reus, mens rea, etc. Next week, we're going to be taking a look at the part 2 of criminal law, and you'll be reading the second half of chapter 4. And in that, we're going to be taking a look at criminal defenses. And so that's what we've got on the docket for the next 2 weeks, focusing on criminal law. And then after topic 6, or after next week, then you'll be taking your midterm exam. So let's go ahead and get started on the topics or the information that we're going to be covering in part 1 this week. So to get us thinking about criminal law, let's think about law just more broadly and the impact that law has on our lives. As your textbook points out, in modern America, laws govern nearly every aspect of our lives. Just take the commerce and the economy, for example. When you get in your car and you fill your car up with gas, right there you're triggering, and laws are interacting on your life in many ways. For one, you're likely to pay a tax on your gasoline. The cost of your gas might be related to treaties that we have with countries that produce gas, and so that the cost of gas is going to fluctuate as the international treaties change, or as international circumstances are altered. When you think about the amount of money that you get paid for the job that you do, we have minimum wage laws. And so again, laws impacting our commerce and our economy. Laws impact and have control over our private relationships. As you know, I'm married. You met my husband last week when we were doing the lecture on which house should we rob. And so, that marriage is controlled by law. The state tells you, sets guidelines, or not set guidelines, but, basically says who can and cannot get married. You have to be a certain age to get married. You can't marry your cousins, those sorts of things. And so there are certain laws governing marriage, and the laws also, when it comes to marriage, govern the types of benefits that you get regarding taxes, regarding estate, regarding how we define property. The law also engages in settling personal disputes that we might have with other people or with organizations. And so, sticking with the idea of family life, if you're married and then, heaven forbid, you get a divorce, well, there's a whole set of laws that govern how people get divorced and how you dissolve your marriage, settle the dispute over that this marriage isn't working anymore, custody laws, etc. So laws govern our life in those ways as well. And the laws control relationships between individuals and the government. And so obviously, government tells us what kind of behaviors we can and cannot engage in. That's criminal law. And so basically it gives us a sense of what our relationship to the government's going to be. But it also tells us about how much taxes we have to pay, what kind of benefits that we might get for being a citizen of the United States, etc. And so we are a society that is governed by laws. And as that quote from President John F. Kennedy says, that certain other societies may respect the rule of force, but we respect the rule of law. And in such, laws govern vast components and aspects of our life. So yes, law has an impact on how our lives are structured and how we interact with each other and with our governments. But what are the main categories of law that you're going to be learning about in your textbook? Well, the next 2 weeks, we're going to be taking a look at criminal law. So one major category of law is criminal law. And criminal law is defined as the body of rules that define crimes, sets out their punishments, and mandates the procedures for carrying out the criminal justice process. And we're going to be going into a lot more detail about criminal law in just one moment. Another category of law is what's known as civil law. And civil law is just all laws that are not criminal, okay? So if it is not criminal law, it falls in the category of civil law. And civil law are the set of rules that outline how to deal with the disputes that arise between private individuals and organizations. So for example, criminal law is where the state will pass a law saying that this kind of behavior is criminalized. So if you engage in it, you've committed a crime, and then it will tell us what the punishment is for that crime, and also what the procedures are followed that we follow in terms of determining whether or not somebody is actually guilty of that crime. Okay, so that's criminal law. An example of civil law has to do with governing the disputes between individuals. I used the example in the last slide about divorce, that it is a dispute between two people, a husband and a wife, and that you're basically saying that you no longer want to be married, and then the civil law sets out the rules for dividing property. Civil law also has to do with governing disputes over contracts, right? That you sign a contract, there are two parties, a landlord and a tenant, and if there is a dispute that arises, civil laws give us the guidance for how to settle that dispute. Your textbook also talks about public law, and this is the branch of law that deals with the government and its relationship with individuals or with other governments. And so public law is, pretty vast category. Oftentimes public law refers to sort of regulatory law, and so the government is basically sets rules and regulations about how corporations should the rules and regulations that corporations and businesses have to follow. Criminal law is a subcategory of public law because it's basically saying these are the laws that people must follow. And also public law deals with relationships of one entity of government with another entity of government. So the relationship between cities and states, or states and the federal government. Okay, so those are the three major categories of law that you'll read about in your textbook. We're going to focus obviously on criminal law, but we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about civil law in this lecture as well. So criminal law is divided into two main branches. One branch of criminal law is known as substantive criminal law. And substantive criminal law is the branch of law that defines what a crime is and what the punishment for that crime is. So earlier in the semester, we talked about how, that there are harmful behaviors that are not defined as crimes. And there's sometimes non-harmful behaviors that are defined as crime. But substantive criminal law is just what the state legislature or the federal Congress determines are criminal acts. And those can change over time. I teach a class in gender studies, and we talk about changes in rape law and sexual assault law. Early on, husbands could not, it was not a crime to force your wife to have, sex with you. Raping your wife was not considered a crime because wives were seen as property of their husbands. I'm not making that up. Those laws stayed on the books until the 1970s and 80s. But today, forcing a husband or forcing sex on his wife is considered rape, sexual assault, and it is a crime. And so substantive criminal law that's an example of it. It defines what the crime is, and then it tells us what the punishment will be for engaging in that criminal act. A procedural criminal law are the laws that set out the basic rules of practice in the criminal justice system. And so, when we think about the criminal justice process that we learned about earlier this semester, a lot of that has to do with procedural criminal law. So for example, that when a person is charged with a crime, they must be brought into the court and they must be told what crime they're being charged with. They are arraigned. When it comes to a criminal trial, there are certain laws governing jury selection and how large the jury has to be. Do you need a unanimous verdict, etc.? And so all of those are examples of procedural criminal law because they have to do with the basic rules and practices of the criminal justice system. All right, so let's take a look at some examples, and then you tell me whether or not this is an example of substantive criminal law or procedural criminal law. Okay, the first one, classifying aggravated assault as a felony. Is that substantive criminal law or procedural criminal law? Well, if you said substantive, you are correct. And the reason is because that aggravated assault has a certain classification as a serious crime, a felony. And so that will be outlined in the criminal state statutes, right? And so that's an example of classifying what kind of action is a crime, and in this case, classifying it as a serious crime, a felony. A person found guilty by a jury has the right to one appeal. Is that substantive or procedural criminal law? Well, that's procedural criminal law because it deals with the process of the criminal justice system. And so that in the United States, you have a right to one appeal when it comes to criminal trial. And so that's a process that we follow. If a person's found guilty, they have the right to appeal. They don't have to, but it's a procedure that's set down that must be followed if somebody actually wants to, appeal their case. A person charged with a crime that could result in incarceration have a right to counsel. So all persons charged with a crime that could result in incarceration have a right to counsel or a right to an attorney. Is that substantive criminal law or procedural criminal law? Well, the right to counsel is procedural criminal law. It's saying that if a penalty for your crime is incarceration, we've got to follow a certain process. And that process is you get an attorney, and if you can't afford one, one will be given to you by the state. So that's an example of the process. The punishment for auto theft is 20 to 36 months. Is that procedural or substantive? If you said substantive, you're correct because it's telling us what the punishment for a crime is. A person failed to pay his rent for 3 months and is being evicted. Is that substantive criminal law or is that procedural criminal law? Or, hint, is it neither? It's neither. It is not criminal law. It is civil law. And so let's take a look at the difference between civil law and criminal law so that we get an understanding of why being evicted from your apartment is not criminal law, but it deals with civil law. Okay, so as I mentioned on an earlier slide, the way we define civil law is it's a set of rules outlining how to deal with disputes that arise between private individuals and organizations. And so, in a second, we're going to look at a lot of different examples of civil law. But, when you have a dispute with another individual, and going back to that example on the last slide, the tenant landlord issue, that's a dispute between private individuals. One person owns an apartment building, another person is paying rent to stay at that apartment building, and that you basically have a contract that sets the rules regarding that relationship between two private individuals. The landlord says that they will do certain things, they'll take care of the place, they'll remove the snow, they'll fix anything that breaks, like a broken toilet or what have you, and then the individual agrees to their side of the contract, that they'll pay their rent, this is what the rent is, they will pay it on time. And so if there's a dispute between those two individuals, let's say that the person doesn't pay their rent, and then the landlord is angry because that they are saying you're not holding up your end of the contract. You owe me rent for this month. But the tenant could say, you know what, I'm not going to pay you your rent because you're not living up to your end of the contract. My toilet's been broken for 3 months and you've never repaired it. You don't remove the snow. There are rats living in my house, whatever. You were supposed to get rid of them. And so that's what civil law is. It's an example of it. It's settling that dispute. And it can also be a failure to carry out a legal duty. You can contract with somebody to provide a duty for you and that they're legally bound to do that. And if they fail to do it, then there's a dispute and we turn to the courts to settle the dispute. So let's look at some more specific examples of civil law. Okay, so here are some types of civil disputes. A breach of contract. So what we were just talking about with the landlord, that's a breach of contract. A marriage is a contract, and so if you fail to live up to your end of the contract, that's a breach of contract. If you hire somebody to do landscaping and they fail to do the landscaping, that is a breach of contract. That a civil dispute could be an invasion of privacy. Invading one's privacy could also be a criminal offense. But that if somebody is taking pictures of you and using those pictures, then they probably do not have the legal right to do that, and so you could sue them. A breach of a fiduciary responsibility, that would be a failure to carry out a legal duty. And so let's say that you hire somebody to manage your money or to protect your property. You've hired them to do that financial responsibility. And if you give them money to invest and they do a really crappy job investing your money and they don't look out for your best financial interests, then that would be a breach of that fiduciary responsibility, and you could sue them for that. Negligence, failure to exercise care. So if you hire somebody to water your plants while you're away and they don't do it, or you hire somebody to walk your dog and the dog gets hurt, that could be a civil dispute because they didn't live up to their legal duty to exercise the care that they said that they would. Defamation, slander or libel, copyright violation, all of those kind of fall in the category of civil disputes. Now, when it comes to civil disputes, those disputes will get resolved. They get resolved in a courtroom, just like a criminal dispute, right? Whether or not this individual is responsible for having committed this crime. But the difference between the civil resolution is there's no criminal sanction. In other words, if you're found to be the responsible party for failing to live up to the contract, you're not going to be put in jail. You may be asked to pay for any damages that you might have caused, like you might, if you damaged the dog, walking them, and then they got a broken leg or something, you might have to pay for the vet costs. You might need to complete the contract. If you hired somebody to do landscaping and they didn't do it, a civil resolution could be to complete the contract. But there is no criminal sanction. You're not going to lose any of your rights. You will not be incarcerated. You're not going to lose your liberty. And so that's a big difference between civil law and criminal law. So let's take a look at the overlapping of criminal and civil law. So sometimes civil law and criminal law overlap. And as it says there, that civil law is related to criminal law and that it deals in part with personal injuries or tort law. That's what personal injury law is. One call, that's all, personal injury lawyer, right? Gruber Law Offices. So a person can be charged with a crime and they can be sued for some sort of harm or personal injury that they've been involved in. And that's not double jeopardy because there's two different branches of law. You're being charged with a crime, but you're being sued for engaging in some sort of personal injury. So it's not a violation of the Fifth Amendment double jeopardy clause, which says that you can't be tried twice for the same crime. Well, you're not being tried twice for a same crime. You're being charged with a crime and then you're being sued for some sort of personal injury. Really good example of the overlap of civil law and personal injury law is O.J. Simpson. So O.J. Simpson was charged with a crime, that it was a criminal case, the people of the state of California versus Orenthal James Simpson. And that in that, as we all know, he was charged with the crime, but he was found not guilty. And so that he didn't get a criminal sanction for that. And keep in mind that he was found not guilty because the evidentiary standard for criminal law is really high. That the state has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that a person is guilty of the crime. And as we all know from the TV shows you've probably watched about the O.J. Simpson trial, that the criminal defense was so good for O.J. Simpson that they raised a lot of doubt. Thus, the jury not feeling confident that he was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. But there was also a civil case against O.J. Simpson as well. It was a wrongful death suit that was pursued by Nicole Simpson's parents. And in that case, O.J. Simpson was found to be responsible for a wrongful death. So he was acquitted in the criminal case, found not guilty, but he was found responsible in the wrongful death suit that was brought by Nicole Brown Simpson's parents. And that's in part because there's a lower evidentiary standard. The evidentiary standard in civil cases is by a preponderance of the evidence. And so it's easier to find somebody responsible because you say, looking at all of the evidence, that the preponderance of it, most of it, is suggesting that this person is in fact responsible. But you could still maybe have some doubt about whether or not the person is fully responsible, but that wouldn't be enough, right? I mean, you could say, well, he's responsible because the preponderance of evidence suggests so. You can ask yourself, why is there a different burden of proof for civil cases and criminal cases? Well, a lot of it has to do with the sanction. The sanction that O.J. Simpson got for being found responsible for wrongful death is he wasn't sent to prison. There wasn't a criminal sanction, but there was a financial sanction that he had to pay Nicole Brown Simpson's family for the costs that was the damages associated with the death of their daughter. And that's where O.J. Simpson, had to sell off his Heisman Trophy and others in order to pay for that. So there is a summary concept box in chapter 4 that I make sure that you take a look at because it does a really good job of showing the similarities and differences between criminal law and personal injury law or tort law. And so, I'll let you read it, but, they're both involved with controlling behaviors, right? There is an imposition of a sanction. Courtrooms are used, juries are used to determine whether the person is guilty or responsible. But that there are big differences as well. A crime is a public offense, so the killing of somebody is an offense against the state of California in the case of O.J. Simpson. But a tort is a civil offense. It's a wrong against a private party. Obviously, the sanctions are different. One is usually financial, and the other can be the loss of liberty, incarceration, and that the burden of proof is different. The evidentiary standard is different in criminal laws and in criminal cases and in civil cases. That's because the loss of life, being incarcerated, the loss of life, the loss of liberty associated with being incarcerated or the death penalty is really significant and severe. And so we have to have a higher confidence level when we are finding somebody guilty of a crime. Okay, so let's put what you've learned about the difference between criminal law and civil law into action. And I'm going to give you some examples here, and then you tell me whether or not you think this is primarily a civil case or primarily a criminal case or criminal matter. Marriage and divorce, is that primarily civil or criminal? That is primarily a civil case. Although I actually think on the criminal law, criminal statutes in the state of Wisconsin makes adultery a criminal offense, but I don't think it's ever prosecuted anymore. But correct me if I'm wrong, you guys could look that up. I'm fairly certain that's actually still a criminal offense. But for the most part, marriage and divorce are civil matters. Copyright violations, is that a civil matter or is that a criminal matter? It's both. So you can sue somebody for copyright violation for, stealing your idea or stealing your work of art or your music. But you can also be charged by the state for violating copyright laws. So both. If you ever watch a video, and we don't watch videos anymore, but a DVD, nobody watches those anymore, but it, says, hey, don't reproduce this and sell it because the FBI will get you for violating federal copyright law. Car accident, civil, criminal, both. Depends on the situation. And so, most car accidents are civil in nature. But if you are driving under the influence and you hurt somebody while driving under the influence, obviously that's going to be a criminal penalty as well. So it depends on the situation. Identity theft, both. You could sue somebody for stealing your identity and the damages that you got from them stealing your identity. But there are also criminal laws in the books against identity theft. Denied unemployment. Let's say that you lose your job and then you file for unemployment benefits and you're denied those unemployment benefits. For the most part, that's civil law, right? And probably public law is probably a better answer to that, because it's telling us the relationship between individuals and the government. So for the most part, that's a civil matter that you could sue the state of Wisconsin for the denial of benefits. Now, if you lie about if you're trying to fraud the state of Wisconsin, you're saying you lost your job when in fact you didn't, that could be a criminal offense. But for the most part, denial of unemployment benefits is a civil offense. What if cops beat a confession out of a person? So a confession is beaten out of a person in police custody. That's both. A police could be charged with a criminal offense for doing that, but it's also a civil offense as well, because you have violated somebody's civil rights. Those are just some examples of the intersection of civil and criminal law. Okay, so first we talked about criminal law in terms of the two branches of criminal law, substantive and procedural criminal law. Then we looked at civil law, and we looked at how civil law overlaps with criminal law. Let's move back to talking about criminal law and talking about how crimes are classified. So each jurisdiction is responsible for defining and grading criminal offenses. That is classifying crimes and setting their punishments, okay? So the state of Wisconsin, that's the jurisdiction of criminal law in the state of Wisconsin. It's up to the state of Wisconsin to decide what kind of offense is a felony or what kind of offense is a misdemeanor, okay? It's also up to the state to determine what the sentence is, or not the sentence, but what the punishment is. And that's going to be different state by state by state. They can, in one state, an action could be considered a misdemeanor. In another state, it could be considered a felony. And it's different with the federal law as well. And so it's up to each jurisdiction to define and grade certain offenses. And your textbook, I mean, most of you know this, so we can go over this kind of quickly. There are two main sorts of grades of offenses, felony offenses and misdemeanor offenses. And so, felonies are usually just classified as more serious crimes. So criminal homicide, robbery, rape. I mean, the more serious crime, the more serious the action the society thinks it is, they're going to classify it as a felony. And the sentence of felonies is more significant. That oftentimes it's going to be a sentence of more than a year. And it's oftentimes, not always, but felonies can come with incarceration, more likely to come with a term of incarceration. Felonies could also be punishable by death. So the punishment associated with felonies, as you all know, is greater. Misdemeanors are viewed by society as a more minor offense, petty larceny, possession of marijuana, simple assault, and usually the penalty for a misdemeanor is a lot less. If you're going to be incarcerated due to a misdemeanor, it's going to be for less than a year. But for the most part, misdemeanors do not come with a felony, do not come with a term of incarceration. If it is, it's going to be a shorter term. Oftentimes, it's going to be, probation or some other sort of non-home confinement and those sorts of things. So I know you guys probably already know those differences, but I thought we would go over them anyways. Okay, that's it for this lecture. And in the next lecture, we're going to take a look at the elements of the crime, all of the elements that the prosecutor needs to prove in order to find a person guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon.